and Inheritance, Chapter 29. When the egg is ovulated, it will be swept up by the fimbria into the infundibulum, and it will begin its journey down the fallopian tube or uterine tube. At the same time, if sperm has been deposited and travels up the cervix through the uterus and into the ampulla region of the oviduct, the sperm and the egg, if they meet within the first 24 hours of ovulation, so the egg would have been ovulated typically between 12 and 24 hours for fertilization to happen. If they meet in the ampulla, fertilization or conception can occur. The egg and the sperm unite. Two haploid cells, two 23 chromosome cells unite to form a single 46 chromosome zygote. That fertilization occurs after the work of the sperm. The sperm needs to burrow its way through the protective boundaries, which we see here. The egg, when it ovulates, doesn't ovulate alone. It's not just the egg. It's surrounded by a structure called the zona pellucida, which is here kind of in pink. And then there's a cellular level that surrounds it. Some of the follicular cells also ovulate along with the egg cell, and these are called the corona radiata. When the sperm arrive, they need to burrow through the corona radiata and through the zona pellucida. The hydrolytic enzymes in the acrosomal cap allow that to occur, and the first sperm cell that arrives and fuses with the cell membrane of the oocyte will fertilize that egg. So again, this has to be within 24 hours, usually 12 to 24 hours after ovulation. Fertilization will occur. It occurs in the ampulla. This is more typical of what it looks like, sperm surrounding an egg. This is an actual image. And that acrosome will release hydrolytic enzymes and burrow its way in towards the cell membrane. So the sperm cell has to reach the corona radiata. It has to burrow its way through it, through the zona pellucida. The enzymes are coming from the acrosome. When the sperm cell membrane fuses with the egg cell membrane, that's going to create a zygote. Two 23 chromosome cells. The sperm is 23 chromosomes, the egg is 23 chromosomes. They unite to form 23 paired structure called the zygote. Here again we see our original oocyte that's going to become fertilized. We'll notice it gives us a little bit more information because we see here that there's a mitotic spindle and we see chromosomes lined up on metaphase plate. So if you remember, at the time of ovulation you have first meiotic division and the first polar body is created. Second meiotic division won't happen until that sperm fertilizes the egg. So at this time, second meiotic division will occur, and you'll notice that there's now a second polar body. The sperm head has the chromosomes. The DNA in the sperm head and the DNA that came from the female are going to unite to. We call these pronuclei because they're each 23 chromosomes, but they're about to unite. It's important also to know that when that first sperm penetrates, we prevent what's called polyspermy. You can't have more than one sperm fertilizing an egg because the zona pellucida hardens as soon as the first sperm penetrates, and only that one sperm will be successfully entering into the oocyte. Now we have one cell called a zygote, and that one cell can become every cell of the body. It has the potential to develop into every cell. The zygote by itself is not a kidney cell, it's not a brain cell, it's not a skin cell. It is a multipotent stem cell. It is a cell that has the potential to become any cell of the body. And as cells do differentiate, so differentiation means the cells all start off from this initial zygote, but as they become different cell types, they become a kidney cell or a liver cell. Each cell will still have that same DNA because the DNA comes from mitotic divisions. Each daughter cell receives the same exact DNA that the zygote had, but as differentiation happens, each cell uses the genes that are in the DNA differently. So again, all of the DNA is the same. Every cell has the same amount of DNA, the same kinds of DNA, but what is used is different, and that is differentiation. And after differentiation, the cell will continue to develop. It'll change physiologically, and that is termed development. In early human development, when we take a look, we see that here we're looking at a cell that has undergone fertilization. So if we're looking here, we see ovulation. We see the egg cell entering and sperm about to unite with it. And now we're going to have the union, the zygote that forms is now going to become 2 cells, which becomes 4 cells, which in this is a morula, meaning it's a solid ball of cells, 16 cells. So we see the stages of development, and as it's developing, it's moving along the uterine tube. The morula stage is a stage where the cells are forming a solid ball. The developing embryo becomes a solid ball of cells, and that solid ball of cells around day 6 is going to change in its appearance. It's arrived in the uterus, and you'll notice that it's no longer a solid ball of cells. It's now hollow. There's an inner cell mass and an outer trophoblast layer. The inner cell mass is what will develop into the embryo, and not all of it. Some of it will also form what we call extraembryonic membranes, but it's from here that we will develop the embryo. The trophoblast is one of those extraembryonic membranes that's going to help in the development of the embryo. And if we follow it, we see that around day 7, the trophoblast is burrowing into the endometrium. So we see here the trophoblast fully implanted. It's changed shapes. You see there's kind of like layers here. We'll talk about those layering that occurs during gastrulation, where we're beginning the development of an internal passageway that's going to form a GI tract. The gastrula we see is embedded now in the endometrium of the uterine wall. So implantation happens around 7 days after fertilization. And that initial blastula or blastocyst, the trophoblast layer, is, many people use the word parasitic to describe it. If this is the uterine wall where the endometrium is, it literally breaks down the cells in the area and it invades. You'll notice the word invading. It literally invades into the endometrium. So this structure, the trophoblast, is going to help form the placenta. And it's going to be secreting human chorionic gonadotrophin, which we'll mention in a moment, which is important in maintaining the corpus luteum so that the corpus luteum will keep secreting estrogen and progesterone. Coming back to that inner cell mass, we see here now some differentiation. We see here the amniotic cavity, which forms the amniotic sac, and we see here this 3-layer structure labeled ectoderm, mesoderm, and endoderm. This region is the yolk sac, which is going to nourish the initial developing embryo. And these 3 layers are going to form the tissues of our body. The endoderm forms the epithelium that lines your GI tract. So it's internal lining of epithelium in your GI tract and your respiratory tract. Mesoderm forms all of the middle structures. So there's a lot of things made by mesoderm, like muscle, blood vessels, bone, connective tissues. And ectoderm is going to form your outer skin layer as well as your nervous system. Here we're seeing much more detailed structure now. Embryo kind of forms like a disc-like structure. Here's the amniotic cavity with the amniotic sac around it. The yolk sac again nourishing and providing for the developing embryo. The trophoblast becomes more structured and it begins to develop what we call chorionic villi, and you'll notice that the chorionic villi is all around evenly around the developing embryo, But if we come down here and we're looking here at the endometrium where the trophoblast is implanted, so the endometrium is totally surrounding this growing embryo. You'll notice now that the chorionic villi are all oriented towards the main part of the endometrium where the blood vessels are going to be, because the chorionic villi are going to be become part of the placenta that is going to receive the oxygen and nutrients from the maternal blood system. Here we are at week 10. This was week 5. Here we are at week 10. And we see here a very developed chorionic villi, which is going to be part of the placenta. So this is part of the placenta. The placenta is a combination of the chorionic villi of the fetus and the endometrium of the mother. We see that original connecting stalk. We see it's now formed our umbilical cord. And the chorionic villi, again, as I mentioned, is facing towards the blood vessels of the endometrium. We don't see chorionic villi on the other surface, which is facing the uterine lumen. This is the lumen of the uterus. You'll see the lumen becoming smaller and smaller and smaller as the embryo grows. So if you remember, if this is the umbilical cord, we're looking at villi. This is a villus. Here's another villus coming down. These are villi that are coming down into the endometrium. So if we look at a villus down in this picture, we'll notice that there are blood vessels running through it, which connect up into the placenta. And we'll notice that the endometrium is being colored here as a kind of a purplish color. And what we're actually seeing is maternal blood that's bathing the villi. So if we look back at this picture now, this is maternal endometrium. Here's a maternal vein, here's a maternal artery, and the veins and the arteries are literally broken open. The trophoblast broke these blood vessels, and the blood from the artery is pouring into the area surrounding the villi, where the tissue has been destroyed by the trophoblast, and the oxygenated blood will return into the maternal veins. The chorionic villi are providing a way to pick up nutrients and oxygen from the maternal blood through these chorionic villi. So the maternal blood is bathing and surrounding the villi, and there's going to be an exchange of oxygen and nutrients from the mother into the developing embryo and fetus, while the fetal waste products will be delivered to the maternal blood system and returned. Mother will deal with the waste products. We know that the umbilical cord is going to connect to the fetus. Again, the placenta is a combination of maternal and fetal tissue. It's just some images. Week 2, this is what the developing embryo looks like. Week 4, the developing embryo is already developing some human structures. So this is only 1 month after conception. Basically 2 weeks after the woman has missed her first period. We already see arm buds. We already begin to see the development of the eye and the ear. Week 8, this is 6 weeks after the woman knows that she's pregnant. So this is considered the end of the embryonic stage. We see the arms and the legs have developed, the eye and the ear, and we see, of course, the amniotic sac around it. And here we see a 12-week fetus. After week 8, we call it a fetus. So it's embryo till the end of the 8th week. That's the first trimester. And the fetus is from the second trimester on till birth, a 4-month fetus. In the first trimester, all the organ systems are beginning to develop and really are forming. The second trimester, mostly the organ systems are developing into more complex structures. Third trimester, they're mostly just growing. The organ systems are becoming functional and basically just growing in size. If we take a look, in the first 2 weeks after conception, after fertilization, we go through our cell divisions and we form the structure that's going to invade into the maternal endometrium. We get the development of the germ layers, meaning the ectoderm, endoderm, and mesoderm. By week 3, we're already seeing an actual embryonic structure where some of the central nervous system is developed. The heart itself is actually starting to beat by day 21. Eyes are developing week 4, and so on. And this The blue tells us when the important parts, the very major parts of development are occurring in the central nervous system, but the central nervous system continues to develop all the way till term, and in fact it continues to develop through childhood. The heart begins developing around week 3 and starts beating, as I told you, day 21, and most of it's basically finished developing by week 6, but there's other minor developments that will continue into some later weeks. And we see, again, the bulk of the development of all these organ systems are completed by the end of the first trimester. A teratogen is something that can cause an embryonic malformation where the embryo won't develop normally. Accutane, a lot of people take Accutane for their acne, and it should never be taken when pregnant because it causes malformation in the development of the embryos. So this is very dangerous when pregnant. Years ago, in the 50s, some medications were given to women to help actually prevent nausea and to help stabilize their pregnancies, and it had devastating effects. At least the thalidomide in particular had devastating effects. It caused the arm, week 5 or so. The limb buds, you'll notice, are growing here. It stopped the limbs of those fetuses, those embryos, from developing, and those children were born without their legs developed, but their arms stopped developing, and they basically were born with these very short little floppy arms. Prenatal development is what we call birth, the development of the embryo till 2 months, and fetus from week 9 till birth. That's prenatal, before birth. And here we again see some images, 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 6 weeks. We see such rapid development. This is day 56. This is not even 2 months after conception. And postnatal is from birth to maturity. Neonatal is considered birth to 1 month, infancy till 2 years, and childhood till adolescence. And adolescence, of course, is when you reach puberty and begin development there, the sexual maturation. The maternal body has to adapt to the presence of this developing fetus. If you'll notice the normal positioning of organs in a non-pregnant female, take a look at what's happening over here as the fetus develops. All of these organs are being pushed upward. The fetal head is pressing down on the bladder, so a lot of women need to urinate frequently. But other things are happening in order to maintain this extra tissue and the growth that's happening here. So respiration rate in the mother will increase, tidal volume, the amount of air coming in and out will increase, the blood volume of the mother will increase. She takes up more nutrients and vitamins because it's going to be needed for the developing fetus, and her glomerular filtration rate increases as well. So all of these changes are happening in the maternal body. During pregnancy, there are going to be extra hormones that are coming. In this case, we're talking about coming from the developing placenta. The trophoblasts, that are those invasive cells which become the placenta, are secreting HCG, human chorionic gonadotropin. That keeps the corpus luteum active, because if you remember from the menstrual cycle, the corpus luteum deteriorates starts declining in its activity near the end of the menstrual cycle and becomes the corpus albicans. Well, the estrogens and progesterone in particular that are being secreted by the corpus luteum is needed to maintain the pregnancy. So the HCG maintains the corpus luteum so these secretions can continue. We need these hormones for the growth of the uterine wall, the development, for keeping the uterine wall intact and preventing miscarriages. The placenta is going to be making HCG, as we said, which maintains the corpus luteum during the first few months. After the first few months, the placenta will take over, because the placenta begins a few months later to produce its own progesterone and estrogen, so the corpus luteum will not be needed after a few months. Lactogen is a hormone that will get the mammary glands, the breasts, ready to produce milk and make sure that it's got the proper content to nourish the fetus. And relaxin, which is secreted late in pregnancy, makes the pubic symphysis more flexible to help in allowing the passage of the fetus through the birth canal, and it helps dilate the cervix. So of course this is going to be released only very near term when the fetus is ready to be born. Labor happens, and there'll be certain hormonal changes. Progesterone, which normally inhibits uterine contractions, needs to decline. So there's going to be less progesterone as you approach birth so that uterine contractions can begin, while estrogen, oxytocin, and prostaglandins will increase. The prostaglandins usually initiate labor. They begin some contractile activity, which causes the fetal head to press down on the cervix, and that pressing or stretching of the cervix stimulates the release of oxytocin. Oxytocin then stimulates the uterine contractions to begin, and then that uterine contraction causes the head to press down and stretch the cervix even more. And this positive feedback loop causes the contractions to become harder and harder, head pressing down more and more, greater and greater contractions as more and more oxytocin is released. All of this, of course, ends with the birth of the baby. So if we look at the stages of birth, you'll notice that the cervix is in a closed position. We have dilation first, where the cervix needs to expand in size, and that's measured in millimeters as the doctor watches to see when the baby is ready to be born. The dilation phase is the cervical dilation. Expulsion is when the woman reaches 10 centimeters, and then the fetus can be expelled, and then the placenta needs to be expelled afterwards. So first the baby will be born, and then the placenta is ejected. We said that the neonatal period, birth to 1 month, the organ systems are developing. The infant during this period is beginning to thermoregulate. That's why you always see these newborns with little caps on them, and they're wrapped up in blankets. They cannot thermoregulate for themselves very well. And these are, of course, the later stages of life. The fetal heart, while the fetus is inside the mother, needs to adapt to the fact that the lungs aren't working. There's no breathing, no air is coming into the lungs. The lungs have never been expanded. So as fetal blood returns, so we have superior vena cava, inferior vena cava is coming in. The inferior vena cava blood is going to be bringing the deoxygenated blood back to the right atrium. The right atrium is going to be sending the blood normally to the lungs, but now the lungs aren't functioning yet. So we do have some of the blood going into the right ventricle, but we'll notice that there's also an alternative pathway. There's something called the foramen ovale. It's an opening between the atria, and blood will go from the right atrium into the left atrium. And from the left atrium, it will now go into the left ventricle and will continue into the aorta. The other pathway that can happen is the blood can go directly into the aorta. The other pathway that can happen is the blood that goes from the right atrium into the right ventricle goes into the pulmonary trunk, and then instead of all that blood going off in towards the lungs, there's another connector passageway that goes from the pulmonary trunk into the aorta directly. So most of the blood bypasses the lungs and ends up in the aorta. Now, it doesn't sound like we're getting any oxygen, so what's happening? Well, as the blood is circulating outward, you'll notice we come to the internal iliac arteries. We'll notice that we have umbilical arteries coming off of it and wrapping its way through the umbilical cord down to the placenta. We're calling these umbilical arteries because this is the descending aorta forming the common iliacs and the internal iliac arteries. Its deoxygenated blood is heading to the placenta, and that's why it's appearing purplish blue. In the placenta, it forms these chorionic villi. The blood vessels form capillaries in these chorionic villi. Oxygen is being picked up, and the veins are returning the oxygenated blood. So it's kind of like in the pulmonary system. The umbilical vein is the one with the oxygen coming from the placenta, comes to the area of the liver, goes through the ductus venosus. Most of it goes into the inferior vena cava, and the blood then goes into the inferior vena cava, and the oxygenated blood mixes with the deoxygenated returning blood from the fetal body, and this blood will then be purple in color because it's mixed. It's a combination of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood, and it will do, as we said, go either through the foramen ovale or down into the right ventricle, and then go into the pulmonary trunk, and then go back into the aorta. And now this mixed blood, which has oxygen in it, will be shipped out to the brain and to the body through the venous system of the, sorry, not the venous system, through the arterial system of the fetus. We could see that as a flow chart. So if we have blood coming from our placenta, which is oxygenated, it's traveling in the umbilical vein, so the vein that has the oxygen, comes to the ductus venosus, which is entering into the vena cava. Some of it, you'll notice, goes through the liver to the vena cava. And in the vena cava, it's mixing with deoxygenated blood, so it's no longer pictured here red. It's now a mixed blood, but it's got oxygen and nutrients in it. It's going to go to the right atrium, and some of it will go through the foramen ovale directly to the left atrium, so that it bypasses the lung. However, some of it does go into the right ventricle and go into the pulmonary trunk. Most of that blood will pass through the ductus arteriosus into the aorta. So again, bypassing the lungs. Some of it will go to the lungs, which is good because the lungs need oxygen and nutrients too, the tissues there. And that lung will then be returned to the left atrium and continue its path to the aorta and out to all the different body parts of the fetus to distribute this oxygen and nutrients. And the blood that ends up in the internal iliac artery will head through the umbilical arteries back to the placenta for reoxygenation. Milk production involves is because of the action of the placental estrogens and progesterone. The estrogens cause the duct system of the breast to develop, while progesterone causes the glands to develop. And the first milk that occurs at birth is not really milk. It's called colostrum for the first few days. It doesn't really have the milk component. It's rich in antibodies. Antibodies are in breast milk throughout, but the colostrum is particularly rich in antibodies. And after the first few days, the milk comes in. And the secretions are come out of the breast through what we call the milk letdown reflex. So before we do that, we're going to look at the mammary gland, which had been originally from the previous handout. I've put it here so you can see this slide. The breast, particularly in a non-pregnant female, is a lot of adipose tissue. It's separated into lobes with a lot of adipose. In a non-pregnant female, we don't really see very many glands. The glands don't develop until pregnancy. Instead, we'll just basically, in a non-pregnant female, we'll basically see the ducts. You'll notice that these lactiferous ducts are going to come together and combine and form a few very large lactiferous ducts, which will open out into the area of the nipple. So these glands are going to develop during pregnancy, as we said. And this is the letdown reflex. When the baby sucks on the breast, this sets off a reflex. Receptors will send messages to your spinal cord, which then sends messages up to your hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus will signal the posterior lobe, basically will cause the release of oxytocin from the posterior pituitary gland. The oxytocin causes special cells in the breast called myoepithelial cells that are along the glands of the within the breast. These myoepithelial cells cause contraction, which literally ejects the milk. The milk will pour out and into the baby's mouth as the baby sucks, and that is the letdown reflex. And this is the end of our chapter and the end of our semester.